إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Before I proceed with my response to Mohamed Hijab, I find it of utmost importance to thoroughly and clearly address the quotations upon which he and his fellows rely to convince Muslims that Ibn Taymiyyah was himself a philosopher and a mutakallim, because as far as I know, this is all they have to offer in their propagation of their Kalami innovation. It is on this course of discussion that the proper definition of philosophy and kalam shall be clarified bi'awnillahi ta'ala, and the critical distinction between that tradition and the general practice of rational thought in Islam will be drawn strictly. So pay attention, brothers and sisters, because this is really a whole thagr that needs to be blocked with power and precision. Nas'Allah al-awn ala dhalik. I will start by quoting the comment of one brother who gathered some of these quotations under the video, the previous video from a previous lecture, arguing that they justify his belief that not only did Ibn Taymiyyah condone and promote what he would call philosophy and kalam as a method of argumentation for Islam, he even believed that the Salaf and Imam Ahmad rahimahullah also did the same. Now, first of all, and before I go through his comment, it needs to be established, brothers and sisters, that when the Salaf condemned al-kalam, ilm al-kalam, they did not condemn particular theories of kalam while accepting the method itself that produced those theories. They rejected the tradition itself, the method of kalam, okay? And of course, the Greek tradition that spawned it among Muslims. And while it is quite popular amongst Salafis that kalam is prohibited by the Salaf, it is, in its very principle, not just the particular false beliefs of this particular sect of mutakallimin or that. It looks like most self-proclaimed Salafis are prone to a misconception and misunderstanding of what kalam really is and what qualifies as a practice of kalam following the tradition condemned by the Salaf and what does not. At least the followers of this man are, at least. This is why this is why such a claim by those preachers is starting to take traction amongst them because of the equivocation or ijmal in both terms, philosophy and kalam. Such ijmal that goes in some stances to as far as defining philosophy as the very practice of human reasoning, in which case everybody would qualify as a philosopher. And if he's a believer in a maker, then he would be a mutakallim. If he's a believer in a maker and he has certain conditions and that he forces upon his philosophization, then he becomes a mutakallim. Now, some would say that the issue of defining the terms philosophy and kalam is inconsequential, and that any difference therein would turn out to be semantic at best, as long as we are all able to tell truth from fallacy and proper creed from bid'ah. This, however, is not the case, since as I've started to show in the previous lecture and the one before it, and will proceed to elaborate inshallah ta'ala in this series, the Salaf used to think of kalam not just as a collection of beliefs that ought to be rejected, but rather as a method or approach to thinking about the world and what's beyond it that should not be indulged with. So if you don't define kalam properly in methodological terms, as it is to be understood from the legacy of the Salaf and A'imma in its totality, not just from those particular quotations by Ibn Taymiyyah, you could easily find yourself calling unto Muslims to become mutakallimin in exactly the same manner that the Salaf were opposed to, while thinking that it's okay as long as you think your method does not generate false beliefs. So to cling to such quotations the way that Hijab, Joseph and their friends do in their da'wah is by all means a crime against Salafiyya. The scholarly problem with those preachers, brothers and sisters, is again that they did not study Aqeedah on the hands of true Salafi scholars. The Salafi tradition is to be delivered from one authority to the next, kabirun an kabir, the way true Salafi students of the Sharia, Talabat al-Ilm Salafiyin, do. In order to truly acquire the proper Salafi creed and proper understanding of that creed, you need to be brought up and indoctrinated, marinated, so to speak, in the exact same manner that scholars of that tradition have been, one generation after another, starting from the Sahaba themselves. Okay? The inherited textbooks, we're not just inheriting books, we're not just inheriting ideas, but we're inheriting a method of bringing people up onto these ideas, of raising them onto the understanding of how these ideas work together. Okay? The inherited textbooks of Aqidat Ahl Sunnah are not to be left for people to read them on their own and understand them away from the teachings of this lineage of scholars that these books belong to. Okay, only when this happens do we get such freaks of manhaj who are now trying to understand Ibn Taymiyyah's texts in a way that is alien to true Salafi scholars and to the entire creed to which he belonged, the entire creed to which he championed, rahimahullah. Ibn Taymiyyah is, of course, an imam of the Salafi tradition, but he is not the only scholarly authority in the creed, brothers and sisters. And his thoughts and writings are only to be understood from within that creed, okay? If we are to do justice to the Imam the way he deserves. There is a reason why our contemporary scholars would insist that students of Sharia طلبة العلم should stick to the classes of those scholars يلزموا حلق العلم and only learn those books on the hands of those scholars, not others. Okay, not on their own, okay, or through mashayikh who were not themselves trained onto that tradition in that way. And since those preachers obviously did not submit themselves to the proper process of learning in the Salafi tradition, as I've pointed out many times, they are systematically misrepresenting Ibn Taymiyyah, misquoting him, misrepresenting his attitude to the method they are using in da'wah in a way that one can rest assured that if the man himself, Ibn Taymiyyah, were resurrected in our times and witnessed what they're doing, he would be the first to denounce it in no uncertain terms, rahimahullah. They were brought up, these preachers, to view reasoning and rationalization in their very principle in the same manner, in the same light that a Western philosopher would view it, such manner that was itself the fruit of the same Greek tradition that the Salaf condemned, and Ibn Taymiyyah did everything he could to warn against. Okay? You see, brothers and sisters, the problem with this sect of Mutasallifa is not just that they have picked up a few false beliefs from Mukhalifin in Aqidah and Manhaj and mix them up together. The problem is that they are systematically creating a methodological rift between the legacy of Shaykh al-Islam rahimahullah and the legacy of the Salaf. Okay, claiming that he and the Salaf before him viewed the Kalam tradition in the same manner that they were trained to view it, taking nothing to stand upon in such claims, but their deficient understanding of such quotations as the ones we will present to you now. The innovation here is a methodological one, bid'ah manhajiyya, that blurs the strict Salafi distinctions between the philosophical method of Kalam and the method of true scholars of Ahl Sunnah in employing reason in dealing with belief and Aqidah, such blurring that only Asha'ira preachers would benefit from, as I pointed out in the previous lecture. The phenomenon of misquoting and misrepresenting the legacy of the Imam rahimahullah, however, is not in the least a novel one, historically speaking. I mean, I've seen people from almost all sects of Ahlul Ahwa quoting the man in service of their innovations. Even Sufiyya and Quburiyin would do that. The scholar at the magnitude and the caliber of the Shaykh rahimahullah, who left behind him a legacy as vast and humongous as his legacy, dealing with issues and delicate as delicate and sophisticated as he dealt with, such a scholar is bound to have people quoting him in all manners of false ways. There's no surprise there. What those preachers probably don't know is that those very same quotes and the likes are used by some to argue that Ibn Taymiyyah was in fact not in keeping with the ways of the Salaf and the ways of Imam Ahmad rahimahullah. After all, if the Salaf were generally opposed to Kalam, Ilm al-Kalam, and he thought that Kalam was not all wrong, then he was opposed to them, right? Now, it saddens me to say that some such authors understand what it means for someone to be a philosopher and to subscribe to philosophical thought better than those preachers do, although they would also insist that Ibn Taymiyyah was accordingly a philosopher, which he wasn't, as I shall show in this lecture around Allah Ta'ala. In a paper by Dr. Hakim Ajhar, he argued that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, despite being an imam of the Hanbali tradition, was in fact opposed to Hanbaliyah and to Imam Ahmad himself in their attitude to philosophy and Kalam. Okay, he writes, if we agree that philosophy is a worldview built on abstract concepts interpreting the structure of the universe, we find Ibn Taymiyyah exhibits such an interpretation as shall be discussed here. He believed, unlike other Hanbalites and Pay attention to that, brothers and sisters. Unlike other Hanbalites, that the religion of Islam, specifically the Sunni doctrine, should be grounded on philosophy. Grounded on philosophy. Allah musta'an. Islam, in Ibn Taymiyyah's thought, must be displayed or defended not only by the Quran and Sunnah, but with reasoning as well. This was Ibn Taymiyyah's main thesis, that religion and reason accord each other. There is hardly a single religious issue that cannot be conceptualized rationally. By rationalizing religious issues, he attempted to explain Islam in philosophical terms, covering aspects such as the creation of the universe, God's attributes, the nature of things, the place of man, and the interpretation of the Quran, to name but a few. Like Al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah too aspired to construct a philosophical worldview, leading one to believe that his philosophical thought was more coherent than that of Al-Ghazali. More coherent. Al-Ghazali remained perplexed between the Ash'arite doctrine, mysticism, and Ibn Sina's philosophy, and then resorted to eclecticism in order to combine elements from all these fields. Ibn Taymiyyah, meanwhile, chose a different direction in maintaining that reason and religion, Quran and Sunnah on one side, and sound reason do not contradict each other. Ibn Taymiyyah's writings never implied a blind commitment to any Muslim theologian. Even the works of al-Baghdadi and Ibn Rushd were not adopted by him in every single aspect. Rather, Ibn Taymiyyah was a free thinker in building his own worldview in a manner far from being eclectic. He adopted concepts from other leading thinkers, but in the end created his own individual system. Unquote. Now, if I were to omit the part of this quotation where the author declares that Ibn Taymiyyah was opposed to all Hanbalites in his notion of how philosophy relates to Islam, then they would most probably take the rest of it with open arms, Hijab and his followers. They probably wouldn't even take issue with his contention that philosophy is a worldview built on abstract concepts interpreting the structure of the universe. Because after all, this is what they do really. They start from abstract theories about all that exists, metaphysical theories that characterize the components of this world, what is necessary of anything that exists at all, and what categories thereof can be conceived in light of whatever analogy the theory proposes for this end. All the work of mutakallimin of the past stemmed from and built upon theories like substance and essence, al-jawhar al-arad, and hyalomorphism, al-hiyula wal-sura, and the like. Theories that characterize the nature of every existing thing that can fall under the general meanings of attributes that are exhibited by things that exist within our worldly experience. That's what the tradition is about. That's what the tradition of metaphysical theory does. If it exists, anything at all, and it can be attributed to temporal becoming or for existence, then the nature of that attribute in it must be so and so according to the theory. If it exists and it can be attributed to existing in some place relative to another existing thing, to other existing things, then the explanation of this very attribute of it, the reason it can be described as such, must be so and so as this theory goes. All right. Now a quick look in the books of scholars of Kalam from the past centuries will reveal to you that they adopted this notion of theory to the fullest. Al-Ghazali and his Sheikh Al-Juwayni before him stated in no uncertain terms in their books that Kalam is the science of studying existence and its essence. What tells the difference, the different categories of things that can exist in reality tells them apart, it tells them from one another. So in order to qualify as a mutakallim, you have to embrace some theory of existence, nadariyya fil wujud, as such, on what qualifies things to exist at all, what explains their existence as they are. This in reality is what the Greek tradition teaches as the job of a philosopher. To provide lay people with the means to know if something can exist at all, and if indeed it does, to tell them whether or not it can be described with this or that meaning, or can be attributed to this or that meaning at all. To deliver the light to the blind, as famously depicted in the allegory of the cave by Plato in his book, The Republic. All humans, to a philosopher, are blind until they acquire such a theory, an exposition of all that exists, insofar as it can exist at all. Alright, this is why we argued in more places than one that a mutakallim is in reality a philosopher, every bit a philosopher, trained on the Greek tradition of metaphysical theory, only with the additional condition of working to manipulate this or that theory in such a way as to place some abstract notion of a maker, صانع, within its framework. Okay, he would start with where a philosopher normally ends, at least before he proceeds to address the divine, and proceed to establish the knowledge that the world was indeed created, and thereafter establish that it had a creator. Then he would proceed to determine, under the very same principle of metaphysical theorization and the definitions that his commitment to the theory force upon him by entailment, what attributes and actions should be given to that abstract maker, if at all, and what should not, all the while playing arbitrarily in what notions are to qualify as rational necessities and what should not, following the ongoing debate, okay, which also follows the rules of the same tradition altogether, wherever it leads him. So, fact of the matter is that the mutakallim is nothing more than a philosopher under the Greek tradition who seeks to build his religion upon his metaphysical theory, whatever it happens to be. Had it not been for the apparent attempts of Ash'ari and Maturidiyya to avoid, in the outcome of their theoretical construction of theology, divine philosophy, every belief that that Imams of Ahl Sunnah judged as kufr, and the shubha they have in viewing what they came up with from all that as the actual creed of Imam Ahmad, they would have deserved the exact same ruling of takfir as extreme Jahmiyyah. Brothers and sisters, pay attention, because there's a strong manhaji reason, a strong methodological reason why we don't judge Ash'ari as kuffar. Yani in their totality as a sect overall. After all, the epistemic source, the tradition of reasoning and theory, and the founding principle of theology is the same. Okay? But they only differ in this aspect that I just mentioned. The only difference that sets the many sects of mutakallimin apart in terms of the rulings in the eyes of Ahl Sunnah, those of them who still stick to ancient metaphysical theories and those who have migrated to modern metaphysics instead, is how deeply they have fallen in the pit of Zandaqa. There are those who ended up declaring that they don't see it possible rationally that their maker should have any of those attributes ascribed to him by the Prophet ﷺ in any real sense, thereby hitting rock bottom, so to speak, in Zandaqa. And there are those who would accept some and reject some, claiming that only those attributes they rejected would necessitate, according to pretty much the same theory, his existence to be explainable by the exact same theory that tells us how worldly things do exist. Okay, thereby exhibiting shubuhat that would keep them out of takfir. And there are those who have embraced metaphysical theories, built arguments for an abstract maker unto them, and yet they are too shallow and uneducated in the ways of kalam to actually see what entailments come with the arguments that they embraced and their premises, let alone to embrace those entailments themselves, like the first group did, or try to get out of them like the second group did. This sad state of affairs for this third group is what most of these Salafilosophers have ended up putting themselves into while trying to drag Shaykh al-Islam rahimahullah down to it with them. If they understood properly what kalam really is, and thereby the tradition of philosophy that spawned it, they would realize that they are neither here nor there in terms of doing the homework that mutakallimin before them did, the mutakallimin of old did. And that if they did that homework, they would only fall deeper in the pit, given the methodological commitments they have already chosen to embrace. Alright? I will elaborate further on this later on, inshallah ta'ala. The point I'm making here is that in order to really qualify as a mutakallim, you have to pass the test as a philosopher first. Okay? And to do that, you must have your own worldview, built on abstract concepts interpreting the structure of the universe, okay, to use the words of Hakim Ashhar quoted above. You must do that homework yourself. We're not talking about someone who learns philosophy and kalam with the sole purpose of exposing the fundamental error in the way that those people think and see things, as we believe Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah did. We're talking about someone who commits himself to that tradition itself, starting from building up a theory of existence in this sense, or at least following the mainstream theory at his time, whatever it may be in philosophical academia, and then proceeds to construct all his knowledge upon that theory, divine and otherwise. Okay, this is by no means what the Imam did in any of his works, despite what many people like Ashhar himself here are in the business of trying to show that he has. He never committed himself to any metaphysical theory like substance and essence, or the worldview that followers of such theories would be bound to adopt. Okay, on the absolute contrary, he was critical of these theories. He took pains in showing the linguistic and rational fallacies that such theories dragged the philosophers and the mutakallimin consequently into, and showed that all their innovations in belief and in ta'wil Quran do in fact go back to those fallacies originally. He wrote elaborately about the fundamental error in assuming that people need metaphysical definitions and logical rules, okay, like the kind that the Greeks came up with in order to be able to make proper sense of the world around them. So to identify him as a philosopher claiming that he did produce the exact same sort of theory he spent his life fighting against in its very principle is to turn his entire legacy upside down, brothers and sisters. It really is something that almost amounts to a criminal offense against the Imam, to simply state that he was a free thinker in building his own worldview in a manner far from being eclectic. He adopted concepts from other leading thinkers, but in the end created his own individual system. Okay, that's a crime. One is compelled and is bound really to ask at this point, what system? What do you mean by his own system, his individual system? By philosophical system, philosophers refer to theories of the type I explained earlier. Theories that reduce all of reality to one or more types of natures or compositions as obtained from experience. So when or where did he ever do that or endeavor to systematize his entire knowledge by such a theory? Okay, the author would proceed to force his own interpretation onto certain general statements that the Imam had made in the context of rebutting and refuting the claims of philosophers and mutakallimin, usually by countering some metaphysical claim with an opposing necessary principle that it contradicts, to establish his appealing allegation about the method that Ibn Taymiyyah used in his works and the general category that it places him under as a scholar of Islam. He must have made up a system of his own, Ibn Taymiyyah, one way or another, and it's our job now to try to figure that system out, literally milking his text in attempt to do that. Why? Because the Greek tradition makes it unthinkable that anyone should do as much as the Imam did in refuting philosophers without actually being one himself, a philosopher. Okay, he must have had his own system of philosophy, constructed in the exact same manner as philosophers would. Otherwise, what would he be calling unto people to found their knowledge of reality and existence and their entire cognitive device upon? Okay, he must have had that system internalized in his thought process, one way or another, and we are now required to hunt it to hunt for it in his texts, to finally bring him forth as the philosopher none of his poor gullible Hanbalite students knew how to view him as. Okay, if indeed it is true that his main thesis was that the religion and reason accord with each other, and that there is hardly a single religious issue that cannot be conceptualized rationally, then he must have had his own theoretical worldview that he constructed for himself in exactly the same way that philosophers do. Otherwise, how would he even begin to call any claim or belief rational at all? Okay, and how do we know that he did that? By picking up some positive general statements he made in his literature to counter the claims of philosophers with stitching them up with a system of our making and calling it his own, as attempted by this author here. It's the same esoteric allegation that Asha'ira made about the Sahaba themselves when they were confronted with the fact that they never had anything to do with philosophy. They never exhibited any signs of even attempting to acquire a theory about existence as such. They never heard about substances and the essences, and they never even showed any form of propositional argumentation to prove that the Maker did exist. Okay, if this is the case, then how can they even begin to defend them against the charge of ignorance and blind following, such charge that philosophers would level against them every chance they got? Okay, they need to defend them, of course, because the Quran teaches that those are the best people in Iman after the prophets. خير أمة أخرجت للناس. Okay, so the only resort they thought of, the only way out, was to claim that they must have done something, the Sahaba, in the way of argumentation, in this sense, one way or another, even if they didn't express it openly, debate over it, or relay it to their students afterwards. Okay, they must have philosophized one way or another to the best of their abilities in a way that would leave them justified in believing that they were created at all under the tradition of the Greeks. Okay, under the commitment that this tradition brings. They must have done that because otherwise the tradition necessitates that they be charged with taqleed fil iman, So how could it even be conceived that someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, as prolific a critic he was, would engage so deeply and coherently with all those theories and doctrines of philosophy and kalam the way that he did, without having come up with his very own system, individual system of metaphysics beforehand, the way that every philosopher does? Okay, to someone like the author of this paper, it wouldn't be conceivable at all. Anyway, the point that we reach from this discussion, brothers and sisters, is that someone who has been trained on that tradition could only see someone like Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah as a philosopher, because according to the tradition, he wouldn't begin to qualify as a rationally coherent critic of what philosophers do any otherwise. Okay, so let's keep that in mind now. We also arrive at what we claim to be the only proper definition for philosophy, to define it as a distinct form of systematic practice of reasoning and theorization. Okay, it's a distinct form of practice of reasoning and theorization that has certain commitments to it. Okay, such definition should draw the necessary distinction between those who philosophize and those who just reason properly, because it is utterly unacceptable even by philosophers themselves that the two should be treated as one and the same. It should be clear enough to anyone with sufficient background knowledge that philosophy is indeed a special mode of thinking. Not all reasoning that would be identified by a philosopher as sound or rationally valid should qualify in his view as philosophy. And not all reasoning that would be identified by a philosopher as mainstream philosophy or plausible philosophical inquiry or argumentation should be classified, objectively speaking, as proper reasoning either. Okay? So while the two might intersect, they're not the same. They're not the same thing. Much of what philosophers would spend their time debating and theorizing about is in fact sheer sophistry, assault on fitra, innate knowledge, tanattu', or at best a waste of time on futile, unfruitful questions like the famous Theseus ship. Okay, a thought experiment, for example. In metaphysics, a philosopher like Plutarch decides to overlook the way that all normal healthy humans would understand and deal with the issue of identity, believing them all to be poor blind followers of their parents on that, as on everything else, of course, and endeavors to reveal with a metaphysical theory of his own what identity really is and how we know that something remains essentially the same thing despite changes that could occur to it with time. Okay? They tell him he's a sophist because nobody actually needs to learn how to call something by its name or to identify it at all, following his theory, whatever it teaches. So another philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, comes later and challenges people to a question on whether or not they would still call something with its original name even after all of its parts have been replaced with other parts. If they answer saying no, then it follows that the identity of anything is to be defined by the attachment of its parts. I am myself only for as long as every part of me remains in place, or at least some parts of me remain in place. Okay, unchanged for as long as I exist. In which case, you are not to be called by the name you have had 7 years ago or 10 years ago, because your body has had different cells back then altogether, different cells. Okay, the entire body cells are said to change entirely and completely within 7 to 10 years. Okay, and if they answer in the affirmative, then he would suggest that if in theory we reassembled all the replaced parts from the old you to build a new one, then we would have two yous, okay, who go by the same name, the one that has all your parts and the other that has all new identical parts, which is a contradiction, since something cannot be one thing and two things simultaneously. Now, to anyone trained under that sophist tradition, this would constitute a really huge problem, what they call the problem of identity. Okay, if I'm not the same person I was 7 or 10 years ago, because all the parts from my body have changed now, then who am I? Okay, and would it be fair to judge me for crimes that the older version of me committed 10 years ago, before all the cells from that version were replaced by the cells that I have now? Some philosophers like Leibniz responded by formulating a law of identity, a logical law, brothers and sisters, one that was then challenged by other philosophers who found it inadequate in response to Hobbes, to the challenge that Hobbes brought, or the paradox. Now, for someone who is not trained as such, the entire question is sophist and unacceptable to the core. The question itself is pure sophistry, and the only proper way to respond to sophist questions is to dismiss it altogether. Obviously, the term identity and identical in that discourse are ambiguous, fihum ijmal, brothers and sisters. And this is precisely where the entire trick plays out. I am, of course, the same person I was 10 years ago and the same person I remember to have been 30 years ago, but in my body. But is my body the same? Is my physical structure the same? Obviously not. The reassembled ship in the Theseus paradox is the same as the dismantled, if by the same here you mean the exact same components, the name and the exact same design, the exact same function, okay? The name should change, since by convention, people may have chosen to keep it attached to their own vessel, even after having replaced every single part of it. It's continuing to do that job for them. That's the same job that the old ship did, to fill the exact same space and the exact same character to them, in keeping with the same design, makes it the same ship in that sense. All right. It follows then that the reassembled parts would not be the same ship in this meaning, but rather in the meaning that it has the same parts that the original used to have, and is rebuilt following the same design, and is still the same ship. And in this sense, what I'm trying to point out here is, of course, not the proper way out of the proclaimed paradox, but the miserable fact that it does exist at all in the literature, and that it did consume the time and effort of so many brilliant people throughout the ages, to the effect that to this day, philosophers are still debating its many different solutions. It is precisely this sad state of affairs that characterizes philosophy as a Greek tradition of thought and sets it apart from all other practices of human reasoning, brothers and sisters. The systematic propensity for sophistry in posing questions in the first place, and for making up universal metaphysical analogies in response to such questions, covering all that can exist and all that can be known. All right? So a proper definition that would really characterize the philosophical practice as it should be characterized in a way that is comprehensive, jami', and exclusive, mani', should by all means point at this principle of metaphysical sophistry that the Greeks invented. It must have it in the center of it, at the very core. The principle that makes it the job of a philosopher to reveal from his armchair the underlying truths of all things that can exist, to acquire such system or worldview that this author is claiming Ibn Taymiyyah to have created for himself. Okay? The principle that allows the philosopher to put himself in the seat of authority over the very way that all humans should think about everything that exists in reality, and the very way they allow themselves to learn anything at all about reality. Obviously, to define a philosopher just as someone who thinks would be to define him as someone who has eyes or ears or a tongue. It does nothing to exclude those who are not to be called philosophers. Okay, a similar issue arises with the term thinker, a mufakkir. What is a thinker? Okay, is a thinker someone who just thinks a lot? This is obviously useless as far as definitions would go. There must be a distinction in at least the subject matter or the quality of the thinking that he does to merit the title. All right. Similarly, that's where the term philosopher came from. Everybody loves wisdom. We all want to do it right, or to do what is right. A philosopher, thus, is someone who supposedly excels at loving wisdom. Okay, it's what sets him apart from the rest of those who love wisdom. He goes farther in seeking it than other people. Okay, now seeking it where exactly? In his own head. You wish to learn all about the world without leaving your own room? Think hard. Come up with some good-looking analogy to tell the world that everything that exists must be made of so-and-so and must be such and such. Teach them what the theory implies in terms of what life is about, why they are here in this world, and what will happen to them when they die, when they leave it. And you become more than just a lover of wisdom. You become a giver of wisdom, a revealer of wisdom. It's a revelation now. Okay? You give them revelation like a prophet would. Okay? Only it's a revelation by reason. Okay? Or in other words, philosophy. Isn't this what it was all about, after all? For those teachers of the Greek school, scholastic tradition, to set themselves up as actual prophets of wisdom amongst their people? Yeah, that's what it was all about to them. If indeed philosophy is a revelation of wisdom, all wisdom, as the fathers of the Greek school had intended and would have you believe, then it can only be defined as the practice of all thought and reasoning under some metaphysical theory about all of reality or all that exists, systematizing all knowledge accordingly. Okay, this is where the word system comes from. A rational construct of all that should be believed about existence, starting from some speculative theory about how things acquire the attributes that they acquire and why they exist in the way that they do rather than otherwise, or why they exist at all rather than otherwise. As such, which by the way is a very central question in metaphysics. Why does something exist rather than nothing, brothers and sisters? This is where it comes from. This is where the question itself comes from. As such, no follower of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should even try to become a philosopher, because to do that would be to embrace the principle of sophistry in question and allow for all articles of faith to be treated as though they were little more than theoretical suggestions, which in turn would result in internalizing the source of ultimate wisdom and revelation rather than pointing it up to the heavens where it actually is. Okay? You take wisdom from within you, from inside your mind, not from outside. This is the reason why some philosophers who originally claimed to be Muslim decided to become prophets themselves, actual prophets. Why not? Okay, what is becoming a prophet anyway? They had to define it. Okay, which they only achieved by theorizing in the exact same manner about what it means to actually be a prophet. What it means to actually be a prophet. What is prophecy? What is a prophet? You work hard enough on your reason and your theories. Al-Farabi, for example, is one famous example of someone who claimed to be a prophet and better than a prophet. You work hard enough on your reason and your theories, get yourself immersed in your thought and ideas deep enough, and eventually you would see what prophets claim to see, and even manipulate matter itself the way the prophets did, according to the theory, as the theory would go. Whenever a physical miracle is exhibited on their hands, that's it, folks. You want to be a prophet? Be a good philosopher. Excel at it, and you would become someone who actually does what prophets do. Okay, you want for something to be the truth, think hard enough to come up with a proper theory to describe and explain it by analogy, and that's all you need to do. That's it. This is why it is only natural that philosophy and sophistry would become synonymous in the eyes of many people. If by sophistry we mean employing reason the wrong way for the wrong end, then that's exactly what a philosopher does in order to qualify as a philosopher. Okay? The fact that philosophers in the West Academy have always been the ones obtaining actual knowledge in many fields that would qualify today as proper science is inconsequential with regards to this definition I'm fleshing out here, brothers and sisters, because it doesn't imply that a philosopher would not produce any valuable knowledge at all whatsoever. No, that's not an implication of what I'm saying. Which is why it is unacceptable, preposterous even, to dismiss everything that philosophers have ever said just because it goes under the tag of philosophy. Okay, and I will further elaborate that later. I'm involved with teaching philosophy of science. I myself am involved with teaching philosophy of science to my students at the university, for example. I'm even teaching much of it in my lectures on قناة إقناع. Does this make me a preacher of philosophy in the same sense like the guys from Sapiens Institute are? No, that's not the case. Why? Because I make sure to filter out the useful bits, providing throughout thorough criticism to this theory or that as needed, the way that I believe someone like Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah would have done had he lived in our times. I don't criticize a theory in philosophy following the exact same tradition that spawned that theory in the first place. The way some contemporaries would seek to establish a Salafi metaphysics and a Salafi theory of knowledge and the likes to counter what philosophers have in those areas. Okay? There is no such thing as a theory, as a Salafi theory of existence or a Salafi theory of knowledge, brothers and sisters, because it is not in keeping with the Salafi tradition to engage with such discursive theory and reasoning in the first place. That's the Greek tradition and the Kalam tradition, consequently, not the Salafi tradition. We don't start with building up such systems the way philosophers and Ahlul Kalam do. Rather, we find that endeavor to be the epitome of where philosophy as a systematic practice of reasoning went wrong. Now, having thus defined philosophy as a particular tradition of inquiry and theorization, it can easily be shown in response to the quotations most proposed in these guys' attempts to ascribe their method to the Imam rahimahullah, that he couldn't possibly have been associated with that tradition in founding knowledge and belief. If such is how a philosopher is to be defined, then by no means was he a philosopher. Okay, or a mutakallim, for that matter. All right? The commenter who prompted me to address this issue here, the issue of Ibn Taymiyyah's manhaj and take on philosophy now in this series, at this stage of it, before I proceed with responding to Hijab, brings forth some of these quotations that I mentioned earlier. And he starts by saying, Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't find using philosophical rhetoric as a tool to refute mutakallimin, Muslim philosophers who oppose Quran and Sunnah, and also as a means of da'wah problematic. He doesn't find it problematic. Okay? And I can only respond to this by pointing out the fatal ambiguity in the term using philosophical rhetoric here. Brother, when you deal with such delicate issues, you have to be as precise and cogently elaborate and articulate as humanly possible. It is by no means a scholarly practice to use such a term in this context without bothering with a definition for it, a strict and clear definition. Okay, if by using philosophical rhetoric you mean philosophical terminology and some arguments in the way of refuting the opponent's claims, pointing out their false entailments and the false grounds upon which they built it and the types of errors they suffer from, both in method and in theory, then yes, of course, he did that. I do that too, all the time. However, it does not make him a philosopher in the sense that Hijab and other like-minded preachers would have him depicted. Okay, the commenter goes on to say, in fact, he encourages, meaning Ibn Taymiyyah, people to indulge in these sciences because he finds this as a beneficial mental exercise like mathematics. And to that I say, of course, people are encouraged to indulge in beneficial exercises of the mind and to benefit from that. Okay, there's no denying that benefit or the demand for it in general. However, to claim that the Imam means by that to follow the Kalam method in arguing for the existence of Allah and thereby engage in the kinds of debates that the Mutakallimin have engaged with the philosophers on the premises of such arguments and their entailments, following the tradition they generally observe in this respect, to claim that this is what he encourages is to destroy his entire Salafi stance with respect to Kalam and Mutakallimin and the manhaj he committed himself to in this respect, following one or two quotations that you insist on taking out of context in what is nowhere near the intellectual honesty that students of Sharia are bound to exhibit. Okay? He adds, in fact, in his book Reason, اللي هو درء التعارض تعارض العقل والنقل, Reason and Revelation, he engages in what we call philosophy. He's addressing me. He says he engages in what you call philosophy to refute Fakhruddin al-Razi and defend the Sunnah, the Athari Aqidah Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And I say, no, he doesn't. To that I say, no, brother, he doesn't. He engages in rational argumentation, of course. Lots of it. Rational refutations of the doctrine you mentioned and many others. And he does an impeccable job with it. Jazahullah khayran an al-Muslimin. Does it qualify, though, as philosophy, just because he addressed philosophical theories and doctrines with rational criticism? Does what he did qualify as philosophy? No, of course not. Not every critic of a philosophical theory or method would have to be a philosopher himself in order to be able to do that. Or would be doing it through the philosophical method or under the philosophical tradition that I just highlighted in the previous part of the lecture. You really need to reconsider what it is that you mean by engaging in philosophy when you attribute it to an imam of Ahl Sunnah. Okay, this is so critical because it stands on the edge of what distinguishes Ahl Sunnah from Ahlul Kalam. This is not to be taken lightly. Not to be taken lightly. Okay. He goes on to say, it's very important to distinguish between ilm al-kalam, which involves Greek philosophy, into the aqidah and between philosophy. Philosophy in those times also included natural sciences like maths, medicine, geography, astronomy, etc. With addition to logic and theology. Ilm al-kalam is just another batil branch of philosophy. Saying philosophy is haram is like saying biology is haram because evolution is kufr. And to that I say, nobody needs to establish the proper distinction here more than you, brother. Nobody needs that more than you. Okay? And those who would find Hijab and his friends justified under that distinction. Okay? Like I said, brothers and sisters, Kalam is not just a collection of false beliefs that were founded upon philosophical fallacies. Kalam is a fallacious methodology that was founded upon the Greek tradition of metaphysical theorization. So you really need to learn what it is exactly that we mean by Kalam and the Kalam method and the Greek tradition, which has been the central subject for all of the Imam's criticism and refutation in all of his books. I never said that everything that goes in academia under the tag of philosophy is by necessity of the name alone haram. No, of course. Like I said, I myself engaged with teaching many fields that would qualify in mainstream academia as philosophy. Even this position I'm promoting here in this very lecture would only qualify in mainstream academia as philosophy. Okay, so when we say philosophy is haram, we mean a particular trend of theory making and argumentation, not all the academic content that falls under the title philosophy. In fact, not even all the claims that have ever been made by philosophers in those issues that we would deem unfit for philosophical deliberation and discourse are to be rejected just because they emerge from that tradition. No sane, reasonable person would take such a blind stance with respect to whatever people call philosophy. No, we're not doing that. Okay, and I don't know anything who does that. If you understood what I stated in the first part of this lecture, you would realize that I'm presenting a clear, unambiguous definition of philosophy and distinction of that from other modes of thinking, one that obviously does not accord with the mainstream tradition of the academy in defining it, okay, or hence in identifying a subject matter as a philosophical issue or a particular theory as a theory of philosophy. I've been stating this general meaning in every lecture I ever gave on this subject, so I'm in no position to suffer from such a proclaimed entailment, brother. Okay, that polemic is not mine, and I'm not doing that. Like I said, many would feel tempted to lump me up with Calvinists and preachers of Reformed epistemology in the modern tradition of Protestant philosophy just because I may agree with them on some of their central contentions. Did they end up making true statements? Of course they did. Okay, I would say that even though I wouldn't encourage Muslims to read their works or to look at the arguments and debates that they've had with their opponents, because the method itself does fall squarely under the tradition I'm warning against. So when you quote Ibn Taymiyyah in saying والسلف لم يذموا جنس الكلام فإن كل آدمي يتكلم ولا ذموا الاستدلال والنظر والجدل الذي أمر الله ورسوله به والاستدلال بما بينه الله ورسوله بل ولا ذموا كلاما هو حق بل ذموا الكلام الباطل وهو المخالف للكتاب والسنة وهو المخالف للعمل أيضا وهو الباطل والكلام الذي ذمه السلف هو الكلام الباطل والمخالف للشرع والعقل. Okay, and you translate that to say the Salaf did not deem the essence of kalam blameworthy, for every human being ultimately practices it. And when you do that, you're committing a profound mistranslation of the text that renders the Imam as Ash'ari at best. What he means by jins al-kalam in this particular passage, brother, is the general practice of speech and reasonable discourse, not kalam as in ilm al-kalam. Of course, the Salaf deemed kalam blameworthy, okay, and so did he, rahimahullah, following them. So if we understand such a passage to mean that the Salaf only condemned the false theories of mutakallimin, but not the method of kalam itself, or the practice of kalam itself, then you don't know the Salaf and you don't know Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. He then quotes the Imam on declaring that Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah, did in fact employ rational argumentation in response to Jahmiyyah, and we say of course he did. Of course he did. But when did Ahmad ever employ a kalami argument to prove the existence of the maker, starting with any premises, metaphysical or otherwise, in this particular practice, at the particular manner that Mutakallimin would do in his practice of da'wah? And more importantly, where does Ibn Taymiyyah ever make such a claim at all? He then goes on to bring forth the single most quoted passage in Radd al-Mantiqiyin by those preachers in defense of their position, where the Imam says, وكثير من الطرق لا يحتاج إليه أكثر الناس وإنما يحتاج إليه من لم يعرف غيره أو من أعرض عن غيره وبعض الناس يكون الطريق كلما كان أدق وأخفى وأكثر مقدمات وأطول كان أنفع له لأن نفسه اعتادت النظر الطويل في الأمور الدقيقة فإذا كان الدليل قليل المقدمات أو كانت جلية لم تفرح نفسه به ومثل هذا قد يستعمل معه الطريق الكلامية المنطقية وغيرها لمناسبتها لعادته لا لكون العلم بالمطلوب متوقفا عليها مطلقا فإن من الناس من إذا عرف ما يعرفه جمهور الناس وعمومهم أو ما يمكن غير الأذكياء معرفته لم يكن عند نفسه قد امتاز عنهم بعلم فيجب معرفة الأمور الخفية الدقيقة الكثيرة المقدمات وهذا يسلك معه هذه السبيل. وأيضا فإن النظر في العلوم الدقيقة يفتق الذهن ويدر به ويقويه على العلم فيصير مثل كثرة الرمي بالنشاب وركوب الخيل تعين على قوة الرمي والركوب وإن لم يكن ذلك وقت قتال وهذا مقصد حسن. ولهذا كان كثير من علماء السنة يرغب في النظر في العلوم الصادقة الدقيقة كالجبر والمقابلة وعويص الفرائض والوصايا والدور لشحذ الذهن فإنه علم صحيح في نفسه ولهذا يسمى الرياضي فإن لفظ الرياضة يستعمل في 3 أنواع من رياضة الأبدان بالحركة والمشي كما يذكر ذلك الأطباء وغيرهم، وفي رياضة النفوس بالأخلاق الحسنة المعتدلة والآداب المحمودة، وفي رياضة الأذهان بمعرفة دقيق العلم والبحث عن الأمور الغامضة. ويروى عن عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه أنه قال: إذا لهوتم فالهوا بالرمي، وإذا تحدثتم فتحدثوا بالفرائض. أراد إذا لهوا بعمل أن يلهوا بعمل ينفعهم في دينهم وهو الرمي، وإذا لهوا بكلام ينفعهم أيضا في عقلهم ودينهم وهو الفرائض. خلاص. Now he translates this thread. He translates this to read, however, many epistemic methods are not needed by the masses, and only those who know no other means or have rejected all other means are in need of them. For some people, the most subtle, precise, thorough, and prefaced of methodologies are the most beneficial, since those people are accustomed to prolonged research about fine details. If a matter required little preliminary knowledge, or the required preliminary knowledge was basic, they would find no joy in researching this matter. Philosophical rhetoric and its like would be most appropriate for this type of person due to his nature, not because this is necessarily the only way one may attain knowledge about the matter at hand. For some people, if they have knowledge that is available to the masses and their laity, or knowledge that may be attained by other than the intellectual class, they find they have not set themselves apart and become distinct. They therefore seek out the most subtle and delicate of knowledge, that which requires the most preliminary understanding. The aforementioned rhetoric may be applied with such a person. End of quote. Now, of course, he ended it at that point. He didn't carry it on like I did in the Arabic quotation. Now, it is really staggering how many people would pick this particular passage, though it is the only source from which we should acquire the manhaj of the Imam rahimahullah. Can't you see him say, in no uncertain terms, and so the argument would go, that it is okay to use the arguments of Kalam with some people if they only accept the most sophisticated and most rigorous types of arguments, if they're disposed to such argumentation? Can't you see him praising the cognitive benefits that come from engaging with the most sophisticated arguments? The more complex, the better. Then it follows that the Shaykh was indeed a mutakallim who really had no problem at all with any argument that philosophers or mutakallimun have put forth to prove the existence of God, as long as the one you address with it likes it. Okay, his only problem would be or was with those who would insist that this or that argument is the only way to know that Allah exists. So is this, as thusly stated, brothers and sisters, the actual creed or the actual manhaj of Ibn Taymiyyah with respect to the Kalami method and the arguments of mutakallimin? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I say it again, absolutely not. And if you were careful enough as you read this very book from whence you took out this passage, brother, you would realize that the very purpose of writing it is to show that the entire endeavor of metaphysical theory and Aristotelian logic is sophist in its very core and fundamentally harmful to human knowledge in general and to religion in particular. So by what sense or reason are we required to overlook the rest of the Imam's book, the rest of the Imam's books, okay, his entire legacy, even the rest of this very particular book in your hand, in establishing his manhaj and his religious standing with respect to Kalam and the Kalami method in general, in favor of one particular passage which is admittedly rather problematic a little bit, okay, all things considered. It might seem to be rather problematic at first glance, I mean. A true Salafi scholar who appreciates the Imam's strict position with respect to the Greek tradition of metaphysical theory and argumentation, and who knows that he was indeed the most staunch defender of the Salafi attitude of Imam Ahmad's position towards Kalam and Mutakallimin, would have only one of two routes to take with this passage. A. Amendment, al-Jam', to show that it is not in any real conflict with the Salafi attitude that the Imam himself established and exhibited in his legacy as a whole, or B. Overlooking, at-tajawuz, to neglect this particular passage and overlook it altogether, tagging it as a problematic passage, mawdi' mushkil, okay, and proceed to benefit from the rest of the book as though it is not even there, neglecting that part altogether. The Salafi tradition, brothers and sisters, is older than Ibn Taymiyyah. Alright? And the Salafi attitude towards philosophy as previously defined and kalam is not the innovation of Ibn Taymiyyah, such that we find ourselves in such trouble or inconsistency if we fail to comprehend this or that passage in one of his books in a way that fits what we know with absolute certainty to be the manhaj of the Salaf and of the Imam himself. Okay, we're not the followers of a philosopher who we depend upon understanding his text entirely in order to know what our manhaj is. No, Ibn Taymiyyah to us is not that person. Okay, what I'm trying to say here is that I'm under no religious commitment or epistemic pressure to follow the first approach, which is trying to amend this particular passage with the rest of the Imam's legacy. I know for a fact what he and the Salaf before him teach with respect to the method of kalam, and I'm in no necessity, I'm not in necessity to acquire that knowledge from this particular passage. Okay. And yet I can try to follow the A approach and say that in the first part, he means that it's okay to use with some people such arguments used by philosophers and mutakallimin that do not take any metaphysical theories as premises, as in Burhan al-Hudud, for example. Okay, and pay attention here. And do not compact with false entailments with respect to the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which case he should only be talking about arguments from the false entailments of shirk, arguing from the false entailments of shirk and of naturalism and the theories thereof, like he himself practiced, and like he himself did in most of his books. Okay, as he elaborated in the passage right before this part, where he said, والمقصود هنا أن الحقيقة المعتبرة في كل برهان ودليل في العالم هو اللزوم، فمن عرف أن هذا لازم لهذا استدل بالملزوم على اللازم وإن لم يذكر لفظ اللزوم ولا تصور معنى هذا اللفظ، بل من عرف أن كذا لابد له من كذا أنه إذا كان كذا كان كذا وأمثال هذا فقد علم اللزوم كما يعرف أن كل ما في الوجود فهو آية لله فإنه مفتقر إليه محتاج إليه لا بد له منه فيلزم من وجوده وجود الصانع، وكما يعلم أن المحدث لابد له من محدث كما قال تعالى أم خلقوا من غير شيء أم هم الخالقون. وفي الصحيحين عن جبير بن مطعم أنه لما قدم في فداء الأسرى عام بدر سمع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقرأ في المغرب بالطور قال فلما سمعت قوله أم خلقوا من غير شيء أم هم الخالقون أحسست بفؤادي قد انصدع فإن هذا تقسيم حاصر يقول خلقوا من غير خالق خلقهم فهذا ممتنع في بداية العقول، أم هم خلقوا أنفسهم فهذا أشد امتناعا فعلم أن لهم خالقا خلقهم. وهو سبحانه وتعالى ذكر الدليل بصيغة استفهام الإنكار ليبين أن هذه القضية التي استدل بها فطرية بديهية مستقرة في النفوس لا يمكن أحدا إنكارها، فلا يمكن في صحيح الفطرة أن يدعى وجود حادث بدون محدث أحدثه ولا يمكنه أن يقول هو أحدث نفسه. What this means, we'll translate it now. What we mean here is that the considerable truth in every proof or dalil in the world is entailment. Whoever knows that A entails B would take A to prove B, even if the word entails was never mentioned by him. Okay. And even if he never even considered in his mind the very meaning of the word entailment itself. Anyone who already knows that A entails B, or that if A then B and the likes, then he already knows the entailment, like one would know that everything in existence is a sign for Allah, as it obviously needs him and relies upon him, so its very existence entails his existence, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And like one would know that the muhdath, okay, that which begins to exist, must have a muhdith, someone who chooses to begin it. Okay, as in the first translation and translated here, or were they made by no maker, or were they the ones who made themselves? And in the two books of Sahihain, Jabir ibn Mut'am narrates that when he heard the Prophet ﷺ recite this verse in Salatul Maghrib in the year of Badr, he felt his heart come off. Okay. This is a complete categorization of possibilities. He says, were they made without a maker, which is impossible by necessity, or did they make themselves, which is even more impossible, which only leaves the obvious entailment that they had a maker, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He mentioned the dalil in the form of a reprimanding question to show that this issue he argued with is innately and undeniably true, since nobody can in proper fitra claim that something can be created without a creator, or that he created himself, unquote. So the Imam was actually in the context of refuting the logician's claim that the argument needs to take a certain form, any argument needs to take a particular form and a particular arrangement in order for it to qualify as dalil and do what it is required to do to convey knowledge. Okay, he countered by saying, no, it doesn't. If the mind captures the entailment in whichever form of phrasing it goes, then the argument will have done its purpose, and that's it. That's that. He gives the example of a Sahabi having his heart moved out from listening to the verse he mentioned precisely for this end. Okay, it did what it was supposed to do. Even the word entailment wasn't even there. Okay, the ayah does not follow any syllogistic order in argumentation, and it is not even directed to people who don't believe that they were not created at all, as a mutakallim would claim it to only be a form of burhan al-huduth. Yani, no, that's not the case. The ayah addresses someone who already knows by fitrah that he was indeed created, to remind him of the implicit entailment that if you do know that you have a creator, then what business do you have not embracing the religion of his prophet once it reaches you? Okay, why are you not doing that? Why are you not doing that? Okay, by what reason would you not hurl yourself out of shirk and into tawheed as soon as you learn that the messenger is here? The messenger is here. Okay, this is how the argument works. All right, it is indeed an argument and a dalil in this sense, but it is nothing like what the philosophers and the mutakallimin would insist that true knowledge in the subject matter can only come from. In this book, the Imam, the Imam is essentially defeating the formalism and methodological commitments of the logicians. So he endeavors to show that knowledge does happen in many other ways and through many other routes, none of which are bound to take the Aristotelian format. Okay, so if this is the case, then one is free to address people with whatever they view to be more conducive to the desired outcome. Okay, as long as it is not in itself bound to false methodological and doctrinal entailments, without having to commit oneself to the Aristotelian method in doing so. Okay, so he goes on in the second part to declare that some people are more fond of sophisticated arguments, so perhaps it might be better to address them with such. Okay, however, considering what we know to be his manhaj, what do you think he would mean by that? Obviously and definitely not the sort of arguments and the means of argumentation that he himself spent most of his life warning against, brothers and sisters. Okay, he would probably be thinking of the sort of exposing the appealing and the appalling entailments of whatever else the mushriks and the atheists would believe in place of the creator, not setting up a positive foundational argument, propositional argument that establishes the iman of whoever it is he addresses upon metaphysical premises about the world and the categories of things that exist and the like. No, it definitely wouldn't be doing that or promoting that. This is by all means contrary to his method and the method of the Salaf before him, which is why we said, argue all you want and be as sophisticated as need be in your arguments, but only in refutation of false doctrines, not in the establishment of our own doctrine in the way of trying to get people to embrace it. We are not preaching yet another philosophical theory that needs to be established upon mainstream metaphysical thought, or else it would stand epistemically unjustified, as the philosophers would insist. Okay? Pay attention here, brothers and sisters. We should go to as much length as we need in refuting this Greek theory of knowledge itself. In which case, we would be providing the kinds of sophisticated arguments the Imam proposes here, that some people can only accept the truth if they are given them, if it comes to them in this form. That's what we do. That's what I've been doing in many of my lectures, probably. Most of my lectures, actually. Okay? Now, although, of course, you have to presuppose first that there can be people who only like the most sophisticated arguments when it comes to the existence of Allah and yet qualify as free from ahwa, and thereby it would be okay to give them that kind of arguments they demand, which is something I presume he only had to hypothesize in this text for the sake of his overall argument against Aristotelian commitments. Okay? تنزل يعني. It would be wrong to assume that someone who has spent his entire life drowning in this kind of arguments for the existence of the Maker, going back and forth in the philosophical debates thereon, would be willing to accept anything short of a metaphysically satisfactory argument according to the Greek tradition and the Kalam tradition that he condemns, that the Imam condemns, of the very type that the Imam himself wages his war against. Okay, so to build your understanding of the manhaj of the Imam rahimahullah and of the Salaf at large with respect to that tradition on this passage is to do the Imam a great injustice, brothers and sisters. Even when he proceeds afterwards in what can only be viewed as an istitrad to favor the more sophisticated arts of thinking and argumentation. He gives examples other than the method you guys are trying to hold him to from this passage alone. All his examples obviously included what the Salaf what the ulama Ahl Sunnah would favor in order to get people to run their minds. And to train their minds and to get the riyadat al-dhihn that this is supposed to be achieved. Okay, it's not supposed to be achieved through falsafa or kalam. No, he's not. This is not what he's teaching you to do. Yes, of course, if we do math or engage with ilm al-fara'id and the likes, this would be a praiseworthy way to get your mind sharpened and your cognitive faculties enhanced. However, no Salafi who knows the creed of the Salaf regarding the method of kalam and the debates of the mutakallimin would advise anybody at all to engage with kalam in order to benefit their minds in this way. No, absolutely not. It's only conceivable that he meant the kinds of mental activities he himself engaged with in refuting false doctrines and philosophies in his books, thereby arguing in favor of Islam. Okay? Yes, of course, someone who is as qualified for such a task as need be would benefit from it in this respect to a great extent. It would run his mind in ways that would benefit the mind itself, of course. But surely, we can't expect the Shaykh to be inviting us to do so or to do what he knows and even declares on multiple occasions that the Salaf condemned and lamented and warned against. Of course not. Okay, brothers, it is a fundamentally misguided approach to dealing with the legacy of such an Imam, rahimahullah, to even assume that such quotations would suffice to determine his manhaj with respect to kalam and mutakallimin. There's a couple more of such quotations that I might address in later lectures, inshallah ta'ala, on the course of this series. I've already addressed them in Arabic in length for those of you who know Arabic in a series of lectures that I titled التحذير من السلفية الفلسفية. You may check it out. It's on the original page of إقناع in Arabic. على قناة إقناع العربية. The point here is that Ibn Taymiyyah was not some philosopher whose thesis is of his own making, and thus no reference can be accepted for understanding the method and the principles he established in his books by his own texts. No, that's not true. Okay, he didn't invent his own method. He didn't invent his own creed. No, we're not in the business of discovering or unlocking the philosophical system and methodological commitments of Kant or Hegel or Wittgenstein when we deal with his texts, brothers and sisters. This is an Imam of Ahl Sunnah. Again, this is an Imam of Ahl Sunnah. The creed in his books is that of Ahl Sunnah. The teachings and basic tenets and commitments of the method are of those of A'imma of Ahl Sunnah. He strictly and explicitly followed, rahimahullah, the books of whom he must have taught to his students. Okay, it is not his own innovation. It is not his own concoction. We are not Taymiyyites or Taymiyyah. We are not followers of a doctrine invented by Ibn Taymiyyah or any other scholar for that matter. We are followers of the way of the Salaf, and so was Ibn Taymiyyah himself before us. So if you fall upon a text in the Imam's books that makes it seem as though he promotes kalam and philosophy in the meaning I explained here, then you should take reference in the manhaj to which he ascribed himself and in the many writings where he states those commitments clearly and unequivocally. This is the same Imam who states clearly and in no uncertain terms, commenting on Burhan al-Huduth, cosmological argument, this the one that happens to be the central piece for the da'wah of Hijab and his likes. Okay, he says المقصود هنا أن كثيرا من أهل النظر صار ما يجيبونه من النظر والاستدلال ويجعلونه أصل الدين والإيمان هو هذه الطريقة المبتدعة في الشرع المخالفة للعقل التي اتفق سلف الأمة وأئمتها على ذمها وذم أهلها. Okay, كتاب النبوات. The point here is that many theorists would now take this innovated method in the Shara, which disagrees with reason, and the Salaf and A'imma have conceded on disdaining it, and those who use it for mandatory argumentation and theorization, and consider it the foundation of religion and faith. He also says رحمه الله in منهاج السنة ولكن الاستدلال على ذلك بطريقة الجهمية المعتزلة طريقة الأعراض والحركة والسكون. انتبه، طريقة الأعراض والحركة والسكون التي مبناها على أن الأجسام محدثة لكونها لا تخلو عن الحوادث وامتناع حوادث لا أول لها، طريقة مبتدعة في الشرع باتفاق أهل العلم بالسنة، وطريقة مخوفة في العقل بل مذمومة عند طوائف كثيرة. However, arguing in this Jahmi Mu'tazili method, the method of essences, motion, and rest, which embraces the proposition that all bodies are muhdatha because they are not free of hawadith, and the impossibility of hawadith with no beginning, this is an innovated method in Shara, in the consensus of scholars of Sunnah, a frightful method in reason, and even lamentable to a multitude of sects. The method referred to here, brothers and sisters, is that of using metaphysical theories as premises to argue for the existence of the Maker, including, of course, the theory of substances and essences, and by the way, including the science of cosmology, as we, or the discipline of cosmology, as we shall elaborate later on in these lectures, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, such a theory and whatever definitions and rules it entailed in different sects of mutakallimin, yani. Any argument that takes the statement the world began to exist as a premise should ultimately leave a mutakallim in need to acquire metaphysical grounds upon which to found his belief that the world did in fact begin to exist. Because if it is okay that the existence of the Maker should be considered an issue that calls for deductive argumentation to prove it, then the same is true of the premise the world began to exist, obviously. In fact, one would think that the existence of the Creator, sustainer of the world, is far more obvious than the fact that the world in its totality began to exist. They are both articles of fitrah, of course, and they both entail each other, like we said earlier, but it might make more sense to use the existence of the Creator as a premise to argue against any claim of eternality for the world than otherwise, which is a fact that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah exposed in many occasions in his critique of Burhan al-Huduth. Okay, he makes his point even clearer when he says, commenting again on برهان الحدوث in نقد التأسيس: هذا الدليل لم يستدل به أحد من الصحابة والتابعين ولا من أئمة المسلمين، فلو كانت معرفة الرب عز وجل والإيمان به موقوفة عليه للزم أنهم كانوا غير عارفين بالله ولا مؤمنين به، وهذا من أعظم الكفر باتفاق المسلمين، بل إن الأنبياء والمرسلين لم يأمروا واحدا بسلوك هذا السبيل، فلو كانت المعرفة موقوفة عليه وهي واجبة لكان واجبة، وإن كانت مستحبة كان مستحبا، ولو كان واجبا أو مستحبا لشرعه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم، ولو كان مشروعا لنقلته الصحابة. This argument was never used by Sahaba or the Tabi'een or the Imam, and if knowledge of Allah and belief in Him was dependent on it, then it should follow that they did not know Allah or properly believe in Him, and that's the greatest blasphemy as agreed upon by all Muslims. Prophets and messengers did not command their followers to take this path, so if such knowledge depended on it, then it would have to be mandatory, and if the knowledge itself was preferable, then the method would be deemed preferable, and if it were either, then the Messenger of Allah ﷺ would have made it so, and then the Sahaba would have relayed that to us, but that didn't happen. Okay. This is obviously a statement of rejection of the very concept of employing philosophy in building knowledge about Allah as a proposition. Okay, one that mutakallimin would only get around by claiming that the Salaf actually did practice nadar one way or another, as I pointed out earlier. They would do that because, again, it is inconceivable in their tradition that someone would be justified in their belief that the Maker exists without the use of some stance of metaphysical argumentation. Where would he fit within such theories anyway, if they didn't show that? Okay, so the Imam stands in firm rejection of the very allegation that we need this method at all to learn that we were indeed created and that our Creator deserves to be worshipped alone and no other. He says elsewhere رحمه الله: إن أصل معرفة والإقرار بالصانع لا يقف على النظر والاستدلال بل يحصل بديهة وضرورة، ولهذا يقر بالصانع جميع الأمم مع عظيم شركهم وكفرهم وأنهم لا يسلكون من هذه الطرق المشهورة عند النظار مثل الاستدلال بالحدوث على المحدث والإمكان على الواجب. The foundation of knowledge of the existence of the Maker does not depend on nadar and argumentation. Rather, it exists in the mind out of necessity, which is why all nations would concede that the Maker exists despite the major shirk and blasphemy they suffer from, and they don't use any of these famed methods of nadar, philosophers and mutakallimin, like arguing for the muhdith from huduth or for the wajib from imkan. He says, طريقة الاستدلال بما يشاهد حدوثه قد جاء به القرآن واتفق عليها السلف والأئمة، ولكن تمشيا مع الضرورة والحس، ولا يحتاج مع ذلك إلى إقامة دليل على حدوث ما يحدث من الأعيان، بل يستدل بذلك على وجود المحدث تعالى. في درء التعارض. He says the method of taking dalil in what is observed as it happens is there in the Quran, and the Salaf and A'imma are in agreement on it, but only in keeping with necessity and observation. without the need to construct arguments that certain things, like the world itself, did begin to exist. Rather, those things that we see beginning to exist do tell us that their maker exists. So you can see a strict methodological distinction here drawn by the Imam between the way of the Quran and the way of the Salaf. The way of the Quran and the way of the Salaf on one hand, and the way of mutakallimin on the other. Okay? The Quran acknowledges the previous knowledge of the existence of the Maker as a necessary component in every healthy mind, and further points people to view all things that happen in the world around them as signs not only of His existence but of His wisdom, of His graciousness, of His grandeur, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the vastness of His power. So observation of hawadith, events, works in the minds of healthy human beings as dalil only in this sense, not in the sense that we need to construct a philosophical argument, syllogistic argument, where we prove first that the entirety of the world did have a beginning, to conclude then that it must have had a maker, as in the metaphysical tradition of the Greeks. So when you say philosophical rhetoric, brother, what exactly are you referring to here? Such arguments that the author of the Manzuma, the poem that Hijab is explaining in his lectures, would acknowledge as proper proofs for the existence of the Maker? What is it then that you've learned at all from Ibn Taymiyyah's responses and refutations of mutakallimin, if that's what you end up promoting? Subhanallah. So in conclusion, brothers and sisters, what we have here is an Imam who acknowledges the consensus of the Salaf on rejecting this type of argument, this innovated method, هذه الطريقة المبتدعة in arguing for Islam, the exact same method that Hijab and his followers are now using some quotations from the Imam's books to argue that he doesn't find problematic. Alright, so which of the two parties is more honest in representing the Imam's legacy? Which party should we believe regarding where to place Ibn Taymiyyah? Those who know what the true manhaj of the Imam was and how deeply and profoundly opposed he was to the method of Kalam and critical of the Greek tradition upon which it stands, and thereby understand all his works in that light, doing him the justice he deserves, or those who would resort to such an intellectually criminal way of picking and choosing passages from his books to invite Ahl Sunnah to engage with Kalam, despite knowing that he had actually spent the majority of his days at the Imam rahimahullah in intellectual wars against that method and the innovations it caused in the Ummah. Those who would quote him in a way that serves his actual cause, thereby doing justice to his legacy in fighting Kalam and Mutakallimin, or those who would quote him on claims that would smash that entire legacy, bring it down from the bottom up. Okay, every sensible Muslim who understands what we've elaborated in this lecture with a heart clear from ahwa and hizbi biases should be able to give the only proper answer to this question. Wallahu musta'an, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah.